In the mid-1800s, a group of men in a booming river town decided to gamble their reputations on a game that the rest of the country treated just like a polite hobby. They wanted to do more than play. In fact, they wanted to industrialize excellence. They were going to be the first men to turn play into pay, and in doing so, they'd create a blueprint for the American dream that still runs through the streets of that city today. The story of pork, beer, and baseball. Hi, I'm Michael, and in honor of Major League Baseball's opening day this week, I'm learning a little bit more about the Cincinnati Reds. In the 1860s, Cincinnati smelled like the river and coal smoke, but mostly porkopolyps. It was the meatpacking capital of the world, processing 500,000 hogs a year. It was a fast-growing place, but the elites on the East Coast still looked down on it as a rough frontier. Cincinnati's leaders wanted to change that narrative, and they saw baseball as the vehicle for which they can earn that national respect. In 1869, they did something that made the gentlemen amateurs of New York absolutely lose their minds. They went full professional. They wanted to do more than just tip players. They wanted to put them on salary. And Harry Wright, an English-born former cricket pro, was the architect. He was a perfectionist who obsessed over everything. And he was the first to implement organized practices and the first to scout opponents. He even designed the Reds uniform, shortening the trousers into knickers to show off the team's red stockings. As silly as it is, people called it scandalous to show that much leg, but Harry knew, as a marketer, that it would get people talking. The players he brought in were legendary characters. You had George Wright, who was actually Harry's brother and the game's first true superstar shortstop. He hit .633 that year with 49 home runs. George was kind of known as a prankster too. During long train rides, he'd drop a wire spider toy on the faces of sleeping teammates just to hear them scream. It was a different time. Pranks were harmless back then. Then there was the pitcher, Asa Bernard. He was a pool shark and a bit of a hypochondriac who once missed a game because he thought he was dying of a cold. But actually, he was just kind of hungover. That 1869 team was the biggest juggernaut in baseball history. They went 57-0. They traveled 12,000 miles by train and boat to pretty much humiliate every local team they could find. In one game, again, this is baseball that we're talking about, they won 103-8. But that perfection created a small tolerance for failure. When they finally lost an 11-inning game to the Brooklyn Atlantics in 1870, Cincinnati fans got a little bit more than sad. They quit. Attendance cratered because the city couldn't wrap its head around a team that wasn't perfect. But the city's love for the game survived. In 1880, the Reds were kicked out of the National League for the most Cincinnati reason possible. They refused to stop selling beer. The National League at the time wanted a more pious game, but the Reds knew their fans, who were mostly German and Irish workers. They just wanted a cold drink on a Sunday afternoon. And so the Reds helped start the American Association, the Beer and Whiskey League, and won the very first pennant in 1882. This era featured Bid McPhee, the best second baseman of the 19th century and the last to play without a glove. He used to toughen his hands by soaking them in brine. He didn't put on a glove until 1896, and when he did, he immediately set a record for fielding percentage because his bare-handed training had made him so precise. The Reds have always been a franchise at first. They hosted the first night game in 1935 at Crosley Field. General manager Larry McPhail had to convince owner Powell Crosley Jr. to spend $50,000 on the lights, a massive sum during the Depression. Actually, President Roosevelt flipped a switch in D.C. to turn them on. They were also the first team to fly to a game by airplane in 1934. In 1938, Johnny Vandermeer achieved the best individual pitching feat in history, back-to-back no-hitters. It's a record that will likely never be tied. One of the most vivid stories comes from the player shortages of World War II. In 1944, the Red Scouts went to Hamilton, Ohio to look for an amateur pitcher named Orville Nuxall. Orville had 5 kids and a job in a locomotive plant, so he wasn't actually that interested. But the Scouts looked over at another diamond and saw his son, Joe. Joe was 6'2" and 190 pounds as a 9th grader. And on June 10, 1944, just 4 days after D-Day, the Reds were losing to the Cardinals 13-0. Manager Bill McKechnie called the 15-year-old to the game. Joe was so nervous he tripped over the top step of the dugout and landed flat on his face in the dirt. He walked 5 guys and gave up 5 runs. He eventually became known as the old left-hander and the voice of the city for 40 years. Fast forward a bit, that grit carried into the 1970s with the Big Red Machine. This was the best team of the modern era. They had the Great Eight, a starting lineup that featured 4 future Hall of Famers: Johnny Bench, Joe Morgan, Tony Perez, and Pete Rose. Bench to this day is still the only catcher to win 10 straight Gold Gloves. Joe Morgan was the smallest powerhouse on the field, winning back-to-back MVPs in '75 and '76. Pete Rose, of course, owns the most hits in history at 4,192. In 1976, they became the only team to sweep the entire postseason, going 7-0. The 1990 season was another miracle. It was the wire-to-wire year because the Reds were in first place from the very first day of the season to the very last day. They went into the World Series against an Oakland A's team that looked like giants, but the Reds swept them in 4 games. That team was anchored by the Nasty Boys, Randy Myers, Rob Dibble, and Norm Charlton. They were mean, they threw 100 miles per hour, and they epitomized the us against the world attitude of the city. The Reds also have one of the most storied histories of mascots in professional sports, and it started long before costume characters even became the norm. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the team used live animals as lucky charms, including dogs, a rabbit, and even a monkey named Mose who appeared in an 1896 team photo. This tradition of live animals took a turn in the 1980s under owner Marge Schott. Her St. Bernard Shotzi became the mascot, famously roaming the field at Riverfront Stadium and even participating in the 1990 World Series celebration. While Shotzi was a favorite to some, the dog was often at the center of locker room drama, with Marge requiring players and coaches to dote on the pet to stay on her good side. Today, Cincinnati is the only team in Major League Baseball with 4 official mascots. The oldest is Mr. Redlegs, who first appeared as a logo in 1953, when the team briefly changed its name to the Redlegs to avoid associations with communism during the Red Scare. He wears the 1869-style pillbox cap and sports a massive handlebar mustache. His clean-shaven counterpart, Mr. Red, took over in the 1970s during the Big Red Machine era to match the team's strict no facial hair policy. Then there's Gapper, a furry red monster introduced in 2003 to welcome fans to the new Great American Ballpark. The mascot with the most significant history is Rosie Red. Introduced as a full-time character in 2008, she's a living tribute to the group of female friends who saved the team. Back in 1964, when then-owner Bill DeWitt threatened to move the franchise to San Diego, a group of local women formed the Rosie Reds, an acronym for Rooters Organized to Simulate Interest and Enthusiasm. They rallied the community, boosted attendance, and convinced ownership to stay in the Queen City of Cincinnati. Now, sadly, even the biggest legends have the heaviest falls. Pete Rose was banned for life in 1989 for betting on the game, a wound that still hasn't quite healed for many in the Queen City. The Reds also hold the longest current drought without a postseason series win in the National League dating back to 1995. They even suffered through a 100-loss season in 2022, one of the worst in franchise history. Yet every year the city resets. The Finley Market Parade is the oldest and biggest opening day celebration in the country. It's a tradition that dates back over a century when the Reds were officially given the privilege of hosting the first game of the Major League Baseball season. This year, in 2026, the energy is high again. Under Terry Francona, the team is leaning on a bold 6-man rotation, including young arms like Rhett Lauder and Chase Burns. And we still have the fastest player in the game, De La Cruz, who holds records for the hardest infield throw and the fastest sprint speed. The Reds are a team of extremes, the first professionals, the most dominant dynasty, and the longest running tradition. As Joe Nuxhall used to say every night, they're always rounding third and heading for home. In Cincinnati, home is where history is built one pitch at a time, and every opening day feels like the first time all over again.